The fall and the spring lectures are each presented by a full-time faculty member. They're peer-reviewed, and they cover engaging contemporary and historical topics from an interdisciplinary perspective. And each lecture has 2 faculty respondents, one from within the department and one from outside the department. Dr. Wilt earned his PhD at the American University in Washington, D.C., and has inspired thousands of students here at Westmont during a career of more than 35 years, here teaching history at the college. And what's great is he still continues to serve the college every Tuesday, overseeing the ongoing research and cataloging of the college's archives, and producing some wonderful and inspiring narratives about Westmont's history since its founding back in 1937. Now tonight, we're going to hear from Tom Knecht. His talk is called "You're Voting Wrong: How Americans Get Elections Wrong and Why It Matters." And I did have to say that, you know, if anybody knows my background speaking for Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, Young America's Foundation, I just wanted to let Tom know that I always vote right. So, so you might be getting it wrong, but you know. Anyway, Tom, we're really happy to have him this evening giving this presentation. He's an associate professor in the poli-sci department, and he has a bachelor's degree from Stanford. Hopefully there's nobody here from Notre Dame this evening. Okay, good, all right. And because he played football at Stanford also. So, and he has a master's and PhD from UCSB. His 2 respondents this evening from inside the department, poli-sci, is Jesse Covington, and Jesse is right there, okay? And then from outside the department is Dr. Wayne Iba from the computer science department. And so the format is Tom will give a 40-minute lecture, then we'll have 2 7-minute respondents. Then we're going to give Tom a couple minutes to respond to the respondents, what they had to say about his talk, and then we'll open it up to general questions from the audience. So without further ado, welcome Tom Knecht.
Thank you, Dave. I want to thank Paul and the Phi Kappa Phi committee for having me speak here tonight. I've been to a number of these talks, and I've really enjoyed them, so thank you very much. It's an honor. If there's one thing I've learned as a political scientist, it's that people really like it when you tell them that they're voting wrong. They really appreciate that, pointing it out to them. And so this is a true story. I gave this talk right before the 2008 election. I was at the University of Denver, and I gave the talk to a church group. It was an odd setting. I was actually in the pulpit giving the talk, and the group was a collection of senior citizens, and they were actually in the pews, which, you know, I'm no congressional scholar, but I think that's some violation of church and state separation. So I'm in the middle of giving a version of this talk to this very nice group of senior citizens, and they start booing me in the middle of my talk. So professors, if you ever think that your lecture didn't quite go the way you wanted to, take comfort in the fact that you probably haven't been booed in a church by senior citizens. So having said that, I have a couple pretty low goals for this talk. One is not to get booed. So some minor hissing is okay, but no throwing of vegetables and loud boos. The second is not to get fired. So if you guys do not like this talk, keep it to yourselves. Don't tell anybody. But the third thing is to hopefully make you think. You might walk away from my talk tonight thinking, Knecht's totally wrong. The thesis is out there. He's wrong on every level. But I hope the next time that you're in the voting booth, and I guess we don't have voting booths anymore. The next time you're filling out your mail-in ballot on the kitchen table, that maybe you think back to the lecture, and it kind of causes you to think about what you're doing. So I want to clarify one thing right off the bat. The lecture is not about who you should vote for. It's not about whether you should vote for Romney or Obama, for Lois Capps or Abel Maldonado, for the Democrats or the Republicans. I think however you decide who to vote for, your actual decision is your decision. It's fundamentally an individual one, and if you arrive at it thoughtfully, that's great. Rather, my lecture tonight is about your philosophy of elections and voting. And whether we articulate one or not, we all have an underlying philosophy about what elections are and what our vote is. And this is where I think most Americans kind of get it wrong. So I'm going to argue that most Americans see elections as a selection process in which they help bring about, use their vote to help elect a candidate for public office. And so in this sense, a vote is instrumental. It's important insofar as it helps bring about an outcome that you desire. Or, to put in kind of more negative terms, avoid a least desirable outcome. And I think probably most Americans, whether they articulate it or not, see elections in this way. The problem with that, and I think there's a glaring problem with instrumental voting, is that you have a better chance being struck by lightning and killed on the way to the polling booth than your vote mattering in an instrumental sense. Now, notice the instrumental sense part. I'll get to kind of why I think voting matters here in a second. But here's the cold cup of coffee at 7 o'clock on a Monday night. Elections go on, with or without you, and your participation or non-participation in them will not change the outcome. I'm sorry to break it to you. That's just the facts. Thank you very much. I knew it. It was a soft boo. It was This does not mean, however, that I think voting is unimportant. In fact, I think voting is the most important act that we as citizens can perform. It does mean that we might have to rethink our philosophy about what voting in elections are. And so that's going to be my lecture here tonight. Here's the outline of the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as a central problem in American politics today. That's political polarization. We'll look at why do we have a two-party system and how most Americans actually vote. I'll then go on and discuss how I think Americans should vote. We'll conclude by talking about why this matters. And finally, my colleagues Jesse Covington and Wayne Iba will tell you why I'm all wrong. So the problem, political polarization. The parties in government are further apart from each other in ideological space now than they ever have been. It seems like there's virtually no middle ground for the Democrats and the Republicans to compromise on pressing political problems. And so let's look a little bit at the empirical evidence of political polarization. This is what we call nominate scores, and it's arranged here so that -1 is the most liberal member of the House. This is the 110th House, and +1 here is the most conservative member of the House. Red bars are Republicans, blue bars are Democrats. And what you can see here from the data is that Republicans are conservative, Democrats are liberal, and there is virtually nobody in the middle ground. So that's the House. It wasn't always this way. Back here in the first Nixon administration, you can see here the black bars are Republicans, the lighter bars are Democrats, and you see a lot of overlap between the two political parties. Moreover, the median member of both political parties was pretty centrist, right here in the middle. It begins to sort itself out a little bit in the Reagan administration, more so in the Herbert Walker Bush administration. By the time we get to the Clinton administration, we see political polarization that we see today. Another way to think of this, and by the way, this is House, the Senate looks almost exactly the same. We can think of the same sort of evidence as the decline of the political center. The political moderates, if they're not totally extinct in today's Congress, are an endangered species. And so here we see back in the 50s, approximately half of members of Congress were moderate. By 2005, just a handful. And with the impending retirement of Olympia Snowe, there are going to be even fewer moderates in the Senate. So decline of the political center, parties have polarized, and might be a problem. By the way, polarization in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, you might argue that it's a good thing. It gives voters a meaningful choice between two different philosophical positions on how government ought to be run. You have that choice now. You might not have had it back in the 1950s when the parties were so close to each other that there really wasn't a dime's worth of difference between the two. Okay? But I'm going to argue that there are two problems with polarization now. And the first is that our political system depends on some sort of compromise. And the willingness or ability of the two political parties to compromise on virtually any public policy issue is virtually nil. And this is especially so because of the Senate filibuster. We don't have a majoritarian government. We have a supermajoritarian government. You need bipartisan support to get through the Senate filibuster, which takes 3/5 of a vote to invoke cloture. And that's tough to come by. If Democrats and Republicans are not willing to cross the aisle, nothing gets done. And as a result, gridlock and inertia are kind of the norms in DC right now. So that's the first. The second problem with by the way, this is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, for those of you that haven't seen it. The filibuster used for good in this movie. Maybe the filibuster not used for so much good now. Second problem, parties in government are polarized, but the American public is still pretty much politically middle of the road, and like the little possum right here, maybe squished. So let's take a look at the American public. Here is a histogram of people's position on the liberal conservative scale, ranging from 1, which is extremely liberal, to 7, which is extremely conservative. And what we see from this graph is that most people are political moderates. There are very few people that are at the extremes. Let's go back to our look at the House. Here's the House, and if we superimpose on that the American public, it raises really interesting, perhaps disturbing questions about collective representation. Are we being represented by the United States Congress if most Americans are moderate, but there are no moderates in Congress? So, the question of why polarization? And there are a lot of reasons why. I'm going to give you a slightly different one than you get in most of the political science literature, and I think it's because of the two-party system. That voters simply don't think that they have an alternative between the Democratic and Republican parties. They have to vote for one of the two. So let's imagine a continuum ranging from very liberal to very conservative. Here's our unimodal distribution of voters. Most people are moderate. And let's just take an average moderate voter, maybe somebody like me. So I'm right here. And let's put the Democratic Party over here and the Republican Party over here. Who do I vote for as a political moderate? Well, neither party is very close to my ideal spot, and both are pretty much equidistant between my ideal point. And it kind of reminds me of the 70s song. I got clowns to the left of me, jokers to my right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. So we can think in terms of what does it mean to be represented or not represented as a political moderate. What happens if there is a new party, maybe a center-left party that locates themselves here, or a center-right party that locates themselves here? Might not there be room for a minor party to move to the political center and capture votes of people like me and everybody else who's a political moderate right here, right? Seems to make sense. It doesn't happen. If we know anything about American politics, we know that third parties don't get a fair shake. And so, in order to see why, we have to delve into a little bit of electoral laws. So why do third parties do so poorly in American politics? Well, the answer is electoral laws. We have a single-member plurality system, also known as a winner-take-all or first-past-the-post system. The candidate with the most votes wins. Maurice Duverger, this is Duverger here, very humbly came up with what he called his law. And his law is that single-member plurality systems produce two viable political parties. By contrast, PR system, proportional representation systems like they have in a lot of Western European countries, tend to have multiple viable political parties. And Dovijays said, well, there are two reasons for this. The first is what he calls a mechanical effect. And the mechanical effect has positive and negative biases. A positive bias is that it overrepresents votes for a winning party. Negative bias underrepresents votes for a losing party. This is a little bit complicated, so I'm going to give you guys a very simplistic example of how this works. Imagine in 2012, and I'm sorry, Dave, that the Democrats win every congressional race by a single vote. For all 435 congressional races, they win by one vote. Nationwide, the vote total is razor thin. Separates Democrats and Republicans by 435 votes. So it's roughly, I'm rounding up, 50.1 to 49.9. But if we look at seats in Congress, the Democrats get 435 seats, the Republicans get 0. That's a positive bias for the Democrats and a negative bias for the Republicans. Here's how it looks in real life. Here's the House vote share for the Democratic Party. Here's the number of seats that they get in the House. And that gap between vote share and seats is a positive bias for the Democrats, a negative bias for the Republicans. So that's the mechanical effect of Dovijays Law. What's more important for our purposes is the psychological effect. And it's the wasted vote argument. And you guys probably have heard a version of the wasted vote argument before. I'm going to give you some definitions, then we'll work through an example of a wasted vote argument. Wasted vote argument works like this. Voters don't want to waste their vote on a hopeless cause, so they vote strategically for the least objectionable major party candidate. The opposite of strategic voting is sincere voting. And again, we're going to flesh these definitions out with examples here in a bit. Strategic voters see elections in instrumental terms. That is, they use their vote to bring about a desirable outcome or to avoid a least desirable outcome, what we call mini-max voting. The opposite of instrumental voting is expressive voting. So let's clarify these definitions with an example. Imagine 2004 election. Imagine a hypothetical voter, and they rank order their choices. And they put Ralph Nader first, John Kerry second, and George W. Bush a very distant third. This is their preference coming into the election. Now, our hypothetical voter gets the newspaper before the 2004 election, and they see that public opinion polling puts Bush and Kerry really close to each other, 50 to 49, and Ralph Nader, poor Ralph, polling at 1%. What is our would-be third-party supporter going to do? Well, you got two options. One, you cast a sincere vote for Nader, knowing he can't win. Or two, do you cast a strategic vote for Kerry because he might win and he might prevent a Bush victory, which is your worst possible outcome. All right, that's where we get you're minimizing your maximum regret of having Bush win, so you vote for John Kerry. Make sense to everybody? Let's just take a quick poll. How many of you would cast a sincere ballot in this case? All right, good. How many would cast a strategic ballot? And most people do. For those of you that just raise your hands on the strategic ballot, you're not going to like this argument. I think that seeing elections instrumentally and voting strategically does not make a whole lot of sense. And to see why, we're going to have to delve into some rational choice theory and formal modeling. This won't be too painful, pretty easy notation. So the classic formula of voting is that an individual votes for candidate X if the benefit of voting for candidate X outweighs the cost of voting for candidate X. All right, and so benefit is however you derive your utility from voting for whoever you want. You know, it's kind of an individual utility calculation. Cost of voting, people think, well, voting's free. We don't have poll taxes anymore. But if we think about voting in terms of opportunity cost, a term borrowed from economics, it means that $1 or a minute spent in one activity is $1 or a minute not spent in another. And if we think of the opportunity costs involved in informing ourselves about politics, getting ourselves registered, dragging ourselves to the polls, those are minutes spent on those activities that are not spent playing with our kids, being with our wives or husbands, working and making a buck, watching Monday Night Football, or the Giants, which you guys are all missing to be here tonight, so I thank you. You're TiVo in it, good. So the cost of voting and being informed about politics can be substantial if we think about opportunity costs. All right, so classic formula here. The problem is that it doesn't look at the probability that your actions can bring about the desired results. So the analogy of voting is like buying a lottery ticket. The benefit of me winning $300 million is worth the cost of a $2 quick pick. Right? But that's not what matters in lotteries. What matters in lotteries is the probability that my ticket's a winner. That's a probability so low that, again, economists say it's a tax on people who can't do math. Voting might be the same way. What's the probability that my vote for Romney or Obama or whoever can bring about his victory? So scholars took a second stab at creating a calculus of voting. And they said, okay, an individual votes for candidate X if the benefit outweighs the cost, but now we have a new term, which is our P term, and that's the probability of casting a deciding vote in an election. Now, if we think of an election instrumentally, and we think instrumentally in terms of our vote, there are only two conditions in which our vote matters in a selection process. If it creates a tie, or if it breaks a tie. All other votes pile onto an outcome that would happen with or without you. Those are the only two conditions. If elections are indeed a selection process, the only two conditions that it matters whether you vote and how you voted. So what factors determine the probability of being a decisive voter? Well, one, the size of the electorate. I have a 3-person department. If we're going to take a vote, I have pretty good probability of being the decisive voter, so I got to make sure I show up to departmental meetings. If it's a 130 million person electorate for a presidential election, I have a less good probability of being the decisive voter. The second thing that matters is the closeness of the election. If the race is expected to be really tight, you have a greater probability of being a decisive voter than if it's expected to be a blowout. Okay? So let's put some real numbers to this. So let's assume that an individual votes for candidate X if the probability that their vote is decisive times the benefit outweighs the cost, and we put B and C on a scale of 1, which is low, 10, which is high. And let's assume our voter likes Mitt Romney and gets a lot of satisfaction if Mitt becomes president, and they'll put their benefit at a 9. The cost of voting, we'll just say, is a 2. Not that difficult to vote, according to our voter here. What's the P term? Well, a colleague of mine, a math colleague at the University of Denver, we actually calculated, or he calculated these probabilities, and here it is. Wait for it. So if you're an optimist, you're saying, I have a chance, right? So the implication of this is that PB, or the P term, is functionally 0, and if we know math, we know that nothing times anything is still nothing. The conclusion, you should never vote, which is a bad conclusion for political scientists to be telling people. This caused a lot of consternation in the discipline. We can't tell people that their vote doesn't matter. So once again, we as political scientists go back to the drawing board and try to save voting. This is hubris on our part. We're going to save voting. And here we go. Our third formula, which is expressive voting. Again, we vote for candidate X if probability outweighs the cost, but here's a new term, the D term. D term is alternately expressed as civic duty, that you have a duty to vote, or the satisfaction that you get registering your preference with government. Okay? And one thing that we know, because P times B is 0, it is the D term that's doing all the work getting people to the polls. There's no other reason to vote other than this D term. Now, here's the payoff pitch. If voting only makes sense in terms of civic duty or an expression of preference, then you should always vote sincerely. Put another way, vote for whoever you want, because your vote's not going to decide the outcome of an election. If you like Nader, vote for Nader. If you like Jill Stein, vote for Jill Stein. Gary Johnson, vote for Gary Johnson. All right, so why does this matter? What would happen in an alternative universe if people actually saw elections as a civic duty and a chance to express their preference rather than a selection process? And I would argue that it would give moderate parties a reason to form. Moreover, moderate parties might begin to win some elections, or at the very least would force the two major parties to move back to the political center. So imagine a creation of a moderate party right here. If the Democrats and Republicans refuse to budge from here, and if people see voting as their duty to get out and vote, they would end up electing our moderate party. But what I think would happen is that the Democrats and Republicans would converge on the political center to squeeze out that moderate party, which still is good. Policy is, again, responsive to the median American voter who's been neglected for the past 20 years. I also think it matters in terms of political participation. Instrumental voting means that political participation is variable, that people only participate in elections if they think that their vote matters. So why vote if you're a Republican trapped in California? You know Obama's going to win the election. Why vote on the West Coast if you've been watching CNN and they're reporting the outcomes by the time it gets here? You know who's going to win. So in these cases, if you're only voting if you think your vote's going to matter, we should expect voting to be variable. By contrast, if voting is important because it's your duty, then you always have that duty to vote. You can never shirk it, no matter what the election context is. And I think efforts to increase participation by stressing instrumental values miss the mark and end up doing more harm than good. I think it's important, especially to get young people out to vote. I'm a big proponent of civic engagement, especially amongst the youth of America, but I think the way we go about doing it can be harmful. And so I'm going to show you guys a blog. Patty Hunter shared this with me. It was a great blog by 3 scholars that I really respect, but I think it misses the mark. The title of their article, My Vote Doesn't Matter. And so Paul Loeb, Alexander Austin, and Parker Palmer are interested in increasing civic engagement amongst college students. And they're right, increasing student engagement means offering examples of how close electoral races can be. We might begin by reminding our students of the very small margins by which critical elections have been won and stressing the importance of their vote, whoever they may choose to vote for. We can talk about the 535 vote in Florida or the 312 votes that Franken won the Minnesota race. And so these appeals are commonly made, but let's consider the converse. If we're telling students to vote only in tight elections, we shouldn't be surprised when they don't vote in blowout elections. The converse is also true. If our vote only matters in an instrumental sense. In 2004, I saw this bumper sticker quite a bit. If you don't vote, people like Bush get elected. Not true. If I didn't vote in 2000 or 2004, Bush still gets elected. But these are the appeals that we make to people in order to try to increase voting turnout, and I think they're misguided. So here's my conclusion. This lecture can be easy to misunderstand, so I want to be very, very clear about what my position is. My position is that I think voting is the most important act a citizen can perform. It is the one form of participation that most closely models the ideal of political equality. It's a political right that people have fought for and died in this country. And who are we just to simply throw it aside and be so apathetic so as not to vote? Moreover, the vote is the foundation of democracy. If we don't vote, if we abdicate that responsibility, we have to question whether we live in a functioning democracy. So I am a big proponent of voting. I think voting is very important. But I also think we need to be very clear about what elections are and what we expect to get out of the act. I think it makes sense to vote out of a sense of civic duty and to express our preference. And if that's the case, then we should always express a sincere preference. If we do that, I think people's satisfaction with democracy would tend to increase. Public policy would be more responsive. Turnout rates would skyrocket. But it requires us rethinking our fundamental philosophy of voting and elections. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues, Jesse Covington and Wayne Iba, and they can tell you where I went wrong.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Phi Kappa Phi, and thank you all. I want to preface everything I say by, first of all, underscoring, if you take nothing else away from tonight, vote expressively and vote sincerely. Okay? I fully agree with Tom on this, and despite the objections that I'm going to raise, those 2 points he's absolutely right on. He just gets there through the wrong path.
And we're co-authors on this paper.
And I'm looking forward to a whole stream of papers to follow. All right, let's see. Now, and secondly, I want to thank you, Tom, for raising this issue. I'm going to focus my comments on this question of does your vote count? And there's a few other interesting issues to explore here, but that's what I'm going to focus on. And I appreciate it because it's a special case of this question, can one person make a difference? And that is part of a larger question, I think the most important question that we can be examining these days, and that is, what's the relationship between the individual and the community? What are the mutual constraints, and sort of how does the individual and the community mutually form one another? I think we don't have nearly as good of a handle on that question as we ought, and so there's lots of work to be done, all of you students, years and years of research to be pursued. Let's see, is this going to work? Okay, not bad. All right, so as I said, I already talked about the one person making a difference, and I think it can, but I want to also use this time to emphasize the importance of mathematics. So all of you who are still students, there's still time. Rearrange your schedule, take some math classes, because we can't make sense of this voting question or of can one person make a difference, or even how do we mutually form one another without math. All right, so this is the model that Tom presented for decisive vote. Sorry for the small font, and I didn't have time to build this to scale. So the horizontal axis is the number of voters on the winning side of the election, and the vertical axis is the share of the decisive vote. And so in Tom's model, and this graph happens to be for 11 voters, and so in Tom's model, if 6 vote for some outcome, those 6 people each get 1 credit towards the decisive vote. They each contributed 1 decisive vote. And then if any other outcome, you get 0. Okay, so if there's 7 for and 4 against, there was no decisive vote. Well, I want to submit that model is wrong. And I think our intuition tells us it's wrong. I mean, if I get hit in the head with a golf ball, I know that something bad just happened. But if I hear like something whizzing past my ear, and I see that it was a golf ball, I know, oh, that was close. But if I see a golf ball flying over there, I don't even think, oh, gee, I could have been hit by that golf ball. So our intuition tells us there's something wrong with this model. And here's a better model. And what we need to do is separate the share of the decisive vote that each voter merits and the probability of a particular outcome. So here is the share S that a voter contributes to the final outcome is L plus 1 over W. So L is the number of voters on the losing side of the proposition. W is the number of voters on the winning side. And so again, for 11, the losers are 5, so 5 plus 1 is 6. The winners are 6, so 6 divided by 6, you remember, is 1. So the share is 1. But then, as the outcome is more and more lopsided, the share gradually decreases. It's not an immediate step function where we drop to 0. You're still contributing, just not as much. And that fits with our intuition. It's like, yeah, when it was a landslide, you know, I didn't contribute as much, but I still contributed something. I mean, you walk away from the poll, even in a landslide, and you think that. And one thing interesting to notice about this model is that L plus 1 over W, no matter how big N is L plus W, the total number of voters, no matter how big that is, it never goes to 0. Even in a unanimous decision, even if all 11 people voted for this, L would be 0, you still are contributing something to the outcome. Okay, so I want to submit that's a better model for the share, but of course we also need the probability, right? And so the probability is this second bullet down. It's the binomial coefficient for the number of ways that W voters can be selected from the total of N population, divided by 2 to the nth, the total number of possible voting outcomes. And there we see this red line gets much lower. And now you're thinking, well, wait a minute, this is what Tom was saying. It's, but I'm, you know, so it's, but I'm saying, well, it's not 0, it's still something there. And then if we multiply the probability of the outcome times the share that the voter contributes, then we get that blue line, which is the expected contribution or the expected influence. Now, as we go to larger populations, there's 100 and there's 1,000, we see the probability getting lower and lower. This is exactly what Tom was saying. It doesn't count. It's 0 times anything is 0. So why did I go to all this trouble for you? Well, a couple of problems. So first of all, we're not really interested in one particular outcome. We're interested in a number of outcomes. It could be anywhere from maybe we expect that anywhere between 600 and 700 people are going to vote for the proposition out of these 1,000 people. If we do that and we sum over the contributions for those 600 to 700, we actually get a significant number. If we sum here, guess what this turns out to be? It turns out to be 0.48. If we sum across these 100, over 100 possibilities. But that's still not a very good model. A better model yet is to take into account undecided voters. Most people don't vote randomly. Most people go to the poll with their minds made up. But there's a few that vote, that we call them undecided. And so if we say, and let's just focus over here, we've got 10,000 voters, and we say 1,000 of those voters are undecided. The rest of them are made up. Their minds are made up. This is the expected contribution that each voter makes. Whether they're decided or undecided, each voter contributes a significant amount to the outcome. So, all that to say, what are the lessons learned? Each vote does actually influence the outcome. And our intuitions about, well, the probabilities here are so small that we can't really make an influence. So that turns out to be kind of both right and wrong, right? And that in order to get past those intuitions, it's where math comes in. Math is important. It helps us sort of detach from those intuitions, make sense of those intuitions, make them concrete, and then come up with solid answers.
All right. Well, before I get started, I was slightly concerned when I came tonight to see that Tom was not very well attired for this evening. And I thought that maybe I could offer a hat to help him be properly dressed for tonight's event. Yeah. Yeah, if you need to just set it aside, I understand. I realize this is an uncomfortable moment for you. One of the first things that Tom ever said to me when he came into my office was, "I hate Notre Dame." All right, well, first I just want to say thank you. It's a delight to get to read this paper, to comment on it, and to be invited into the discussion of the ideas that are involved. Part of why I like this paper is because what Tom is doing is to tackle a serious practical issue in a way that is, I'd say, creative, provocative, and even fun. I'm often trying to convince my students that political science, political theory are fun, and I think this paper is a good example of it being fun. But these are serious issues: party polarization, gridlock in responsiveness of government, things like this. They're serious issues, and what I think we see Tom doing here is theoretically grounded and empirically supported engagement with serious political problems. And I would say this is exactly what good political science ought to do. Moreover, unlike a lot of things that political scientists do, myself included at times, it's very practical. It's practical for citizenship. It doesn't make just a difference for arcane academics. It actually matters for what we do. And I salute that. Moreover, I think it does what good scholarship should do, which is to invite others into a serious discussion. Doesn't mean a serious discussion can't be fun. I actually think it can be, but I think it does invite us into a discussion, and I'm grateful to be invited into that discussion. So in the spirit of a fun discussion, I've kind of organized what I want to say just around a series of questions that I consider part of this ongoing discussion about what is being proposed here. So my first question would be this. I'm curious about seeing more indicators that people actually do see their vote choice in an instrumental sense. In other words, that when people go to the polls, they believe that there's a high probability that they're casting the decisive vote in an election. As Tom notes, rational choice models of voter turnout have to rely heavily on the D, the civic duty term, about the intrinsic benefits of voting in order to make sense. There's widespread consensus that the PB term is so close to zero that it's difficult for turning out to vote ever to make sense in an instrumental way. Thus, voting, I think, must pivot on intrinsic benefits of voting primarily, rather than instrumental ones. But I'm wondering, do people fail to understand this? Do they really think they might cast the deciding vote in an election? I'd just love to see kind of clear evidence that people really are delusional. Actually, I see good evidence of that every day. I look in the mirror. Or that vote choice calculations follow a different model from voter turnout. Because usually the rational choice equation is used to explain vote turnout. And so either, I don't want to say, I'd like to see more evidence that people don't understand this, or that vote choice follows a different approach. So my first question is just, I'd love to see more evidence that people think of their voting as instrumental. Second question. I'd be interested to reflect more on the causes and problems of political polarization. Tom touches on this, and I appreciate how he accounts for a responsible party thesis and the ways in which meaningful differences between parties are important for electoral choice. But I wonder about what else we might explore here. There was, as he notes, a much less polarized two-party system quite recently, as he demonstrated with the graph on the Nixon administration. I'm curious to know more about what changed. Now, he mentioned some of the rules, the filibuster in particular, supermajoritarian institutions. I'm just interested to think about causes of polarization. If we want to ease both gridlock and polarization, I might like to get a clear sense of the causes before settling on third-party voting as the first inroad for resolving this, particularly because even as polarization has increased, neither the number of viable parties has changed, nor do I have a clear sense that people's understanding of their votes has also changed. So my second question would then just be, what alternate causes might also want to be approached in addition to third-party voting as a solution? My third question, and this could either be taken as more provocatively or, I hope, more playfully, I want to ask whether or not the sort of expressive voting described here isn't, in one sense, and I only mean this in one sense, isn't in one sense a type of free riding. That is it possible, I want to ask, that its way of responding to the collective action problem of voting, i.e. the smallness of the PB term, counts on others to do the actual electoral decision making? In other words, does it assume, in formal terms, that all other things remain equal? So if one recognizes that the actual outcome-related aspect of voting isn't all that significant, rejects the idea that voting is related to election outcome, and instead thinks of voting as purely expressive, doesn't this require that others not do likewise? Particularly from a minimax regret understanding of voting. In other words, if your strategy for voting is to minimize the maximum possible regret about the outcome. So what I mean is this. In actual practice, I think that this argument still assumes that one of the two major parties is going to win. One vote will not make an instrumental difference to the outcome, which frees up the individual to use his or her vote expressively. But what if lots of people begin doing this? Indeed, what if enough people started doing this that it affected which of the two major party candidates won, like some Democrats might argue happened in 2000 with Notre, or some Republicans might argue happened in 1992 with Ross Perot. For those who want to minimize their maximum possible regret with regard to election outcome, this argument for the rationality of expressive voting seems to require that others, or at least most of them, stay constant in their approach to voting. So that would be my third question. Question 4, I'd also want to ask the same question from a moral perspective. I think this is appropriate given the emphasis that Tom places on duty being central to vote choice. I wonder whether we might not say that, well, one vote is not instrumental to selecting a candidate to hold office. Elections, nevertheless, are instrumental to selecting a candidate to hold office. Therefore, we might want to ask, is a purely expressive understanding of voting capable of serving as a universalizable norm that we would want to ask all others to adhere to as well? This paper actually made me go read some Kant. Could we universalize this norm? I did. I was reading your paper. I set it aside, picked up Foundation of the Metaphysics of Morals, and I'm not sure that it could be universalizable. Or does the fact that elections themselves, rather than individual votes, are instrumental to selecting a candidate require our moral framework for vote choice to include some reference, I think as Wayne was saying, to outcome, however far removed from our individual agency? Put another way, what is our duty with regard to elections, and why? If candidate selection is even slightly implicated, then I don't know that we can accept a purely expressive view, even if we say it's a largely expressive view. However, I suspect that the expressive view advocated here actually has an instrumental vision of creating alternative options in elections. So perhaps that might be explored further. In sum, I do think this is a great paper. I thought I had a lot of fun reading it, and I'm just honored and delighted to be part of the discussion that you're sparking. So thank you very much, Tom.
For those of you that don't know, Stanford played Notre Dame in football over the weekend. Stanford scored a touchdown in overtime that Notre Dame officials just completely stole the game from us. And Jesse and I had a bet, and so I have to wear this ridiculous hat. Just putting the hat on, I think my IQ has dropped 50 points. And so I'm not sure if I'm going to be adequately able to respond to the comments. So, Wayne, thank you very much for your comments. As Wayne was talking, it reminded me of the old Saturday Night Live skit with Chevy Chase playing Gerald Ford, and he was in a debate, and they're rattling off a bunch of numbers, and Ford's just kind of sitting there, and he said, I was under the impression that there would be no math involved. So that's kind of what I was thinking when Wayne was giving his schmear. So here's what I think, and Wayne and I are co-authoring a paper along with Patty Hunter and Christabel Stark, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But here's where I think Wayne has gone wrong. That Wayne wants to create, and this is kind of political science-y, the dependent variable as share of the outcome that voters contribute to. And I don't think that's the right dependent variable. I think the right dependent variable, the thing that we're looking at, is an election winner. In this case, it's a lot like pregnancy. You either win or you lose. You're either pregnant or you're not. It's dichotomous. It's not a continuous variable. And so I think that looking at helping contribute to an outcome of an election doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You either did or you didn't. All right? I guess put another way, think back to any election that you've ever voted in. If you didn't vote or you had changed your vote, would anything be different? You can go back to any election throughout history. And if the answer is no, then this idea of contributing partially to an election, I think, doesn't make sense. Or I would say, if you saw the movie Swing Vote with Kevin Costner and you thought that could really happen, then that argument might make sense. But if you think that's just Hollywood fantasy, then I don't think it makes sense talking about contributing to an outcome. Now, you might contribute to a mandate. The larger the mandate, the more important maybe the election. That might be true. But I don't know if you necessarily contribute to an outcome. Jesse, thank you very much for your comments. It's the first time that I've ever been read in conjunction with Kant. I was just really blown away by that. So Jesse asked, are people really expressive or instrumental voters? Are they strategic voters? And this is a difficult question to get at. My first stab at this question was a conference paper written with former students at the University of Denver, and we looked at large N data sets, American National Election Studies, and what we tried to figure out is, are most people strategic voters or are they sincere voters? And the answer would be that most people, at least kind of since 2000, are strategic voters rather than sincere voters. In 2000, those of you that can't see, 80% were strategic, 20% were sincere. In 2004, 97% were strategic and 3% were sincere. If we just look simply at the vote totals, third parties don't get a whole lot of vote share. The exception is Perot in 92 and 96, and Perot did quite well for a third party. So that's one way, and that's imperfect data. It's imperfect data because there are just simply not a whole lot of strategic voters or third-party voters in the American National Election Study, where I draw this data from. And so in response, along with Patty Hunter, Wayne Iba, and undergraduate Christabel Stark, we are embarking on an experiment to try to figure out who would be strategic or sincere voters and what the optimal strategy would be. The experiment works like this, and maybe some of you have actually participated in it. We ask subjects 15 questions. No matter how you respond to those 15 questions, we pair you with a presidential candidate that has no chance of winning the election. So we're putting you in, kind of artificially, in a scenario that you have to decide whether I'm going to vote strategically or sincerely, and then we ask you to vote. And we experimentally manipulate several different conditions. One group gets party ID, They get party labels. The other group doesn't. One group gets a really close election. The other group gets a blowout election. And the one group has a really close preference order between their first choice for president and their second. All things being equal, if you have a third-party candidate and a major party candidate at the same preference level, you're going to vote for the major party candidate because, all things being equal, I'm going to vote for the guy that might have a chance to win. As that preference begins to drop and that gap becomes larger, the greater probability that you're going to vote sincerely. Does that make sense? Okay. So those are all, excuse me, experimental manipulations, and we ask people a bunch of questions after they vote to try to get at individual level predictors of whether somebody is an expressive or an instrumental voter. And that includes strength of partisanship and a bunch of questions trying to get at this question of philosophy of election. Do you see elections as a selection process, or do you see it as an expressive act? And so here's our data thus far. By the way, and I should have had the first slide, more people in our data set, many more people are strategic voters than sincere. All right, so strategic voting is the optimal strategy for people in our experimental condition. It seems to be the optimal strategy for most people in the ANES data set. And I would just say the lack of third-party votes in general gives us pretty good indication that people are strategic voters. But here, it's closeness in the election. This is a close election. Here's a blowout election. And we don't see a whole lot of difference in sincere and strategic voters here. So closeness in the election doesn't seem to matter whether somebody's going to be a strategic or a sincere voter. Distance preference between the first and second choice for president, that also doesn't seem to matter that much. What does matter is party ID. The group that gets party labels are much more likely to vote strategically than the group that doesn't get party labels. And so the question then is why? And I think at least kind of our initial answer is socialization. We are socialized to see the Democrats and the Republicans as the only two choice. Now, when you take away those party labels, all of a sudden, strategic or sincere voting for a third party becomes a rational endeavor. All right, so at least in our initial analysis of the data, party ID looks to be important. Again, here's party ID, Democrats, Republicans, independents are more likely to vote sincerely, and people that this is kind of interesting, people that identify with a third party are just as likely to vote strategically as they are sincerely. I don't know, I thought that was kind of interesting. Here's kind of gets at Jesse's question, is voting an act of selection or an act of expression? Those people who said it was an act of selection are much more likely to vote strategically. Those people who said it was an act of expression are still more likely to vote strategically, but not quite as much. And so I think it kind of tracks onto the conversation that we've had tonight about voting in elections. Will your vote make a difference? There was a question, who I vote for makes a difference or not. If you don't think it makes a difference, you vote sincerely. If you think it does make a difference, you vote strategically. Again, fits kind of the general talk here tonight. If I didn't vote, things might turn out for the worse. Again, we see it from agree strongly, vote strategically, to disagree strongly, much more likely to vote sincerely. Okay? Let's move on to Jesse's other questions, which is kind of the difference between individual rationality and collective rationality. And Jesse asked, well, what if everybody starts voting expressively? And one, it won't happen. So let's rest assured that this just won't, people don't like this argument. They won't do it. And so we're all safe. Political scientists, by the way, I'm not the first person that's come up with this argument. This has been around political science for decades, and we haven't convinced anybody yet. So don't worry if you like strategic voting. It's not going to change anything. Second, if it does, great. I think it would be great if everybody saw voting as their duty and if everybody voted for who they liked. I think that's awesome. Let's go for that. I would go for that over our current system. But he is right that we would have to change political institutions as a result. The first thing is the Electoral College. If you had a third party siphoning votes off from the two major parties and no candidate wins the election, my students, who decides the election? David? House of Representatives decides the election. And I actually think that would be a worse outcome than what we have right now. And so all this premises on us changing political institutions to fit the fact that people vote and vote their minds, which I think we could do, right? I think that would be better than the alternative system. Here's another kind of a variant of Jesse's question. But what about Florida in 2000? If just a few more Nader supporters had voted for Gore, he would have been president. I think that's true. That's certainly true collectively, but it's the difference between individual rationality and collective rationality. One vote in Florida still would not have made a difference. If you were a Floridian back in 2000, whether you voted sincerely or strategically, you individually could not have changed that outcome. It was still 530, what? 7. It's still quite a bit. And if you reran the simulation again or electoral again, it would have to come down, boom, tied or one vote in order for a single vote to matter. It didn't happen in that case, hasn't happened in any elections that I know of decent size, and I just think still one vote probably won't change the outcome. My other answer, and this is kind of gets more into Jesse's question, is the collective action problem. I think that we need to stop worrying about what others are doing, responsibility or duty to do so. And I'll tell a story on myself. I hate trash on the beach, probably as much as anything. I was walking on Butterfly Beach. I was about a half a mile away from a trash can. I see a particularly objectionable piece of trash lying right there on the beach. So if I'm going to pick it up, I'm going to have to carry this thing with me till I get to the trash can. Nobody else is around. I know that whether I pick up this one piece of trash will not make a dent in pollution, right? So what do? I do the individual rational thing, and I pretend like I don't see it. And I felt guilty about that ever since. If I had a stronger sense of responsibility and duty, I would have picked it up, regardless of whether my contribution to cleaning up the beaches makes any difference collectively at all.